Terrific. So nice to see so many people here. Good afternoon. Welcome to our special guest, Professor Gil Troy, who is zoomed in from Israel, where it is very late at night. Thank you for coming. And welcome to the 7 other synagogues who join with us today: Beth Tikva, Solel, Temple Har Zion, City Shul, First Nariver, Holy Blossom, and Beth David. Bruchim Habaim. This event was initiated by Darchei Noam's Israel Connections Committee, and thank you to Simon Shapiro, Renata Krakauer, Andrea Spindle, and our Zoom angel, Kathy Sikora. Rabbi Tina will be introducing Gil in a few minutes and discussing his achievements and his many accomplishments, including being a distinguished scholar and prolific author. We're putting a link in the chat so that you can easily find and order any of his books. His latest book was co-authored with Natan Sharansky, Prison, Politics, and My People. Toronto has a special connection, of course, with Sharansky. Many of those on this call likely remember his wife, Avital, who traveled from city to city, begging fellow Jews to help support the release of Soviet Jewish refuseniks like her husband. Thousands joined her campaign by protests, social activism, and marching on the Capitol in Washington. It was ultimately successful in securing the release of Sharansky, our own Rabbi Tina and her family, and scores of other Soviet Jews. We were successful because many people in the Zoom meeting were active participants, and we were united as a Jewish community. I mention this time because the situation and the struggles are now different for Jews. There's no longer the Iron Curtain, but the insidious contamination of some of our most respected institutions, our universities, our schools, newspapers, television, and occasionally even our own political parties. Israel is held to a different standard than other nations, and its right to exist as an independent Jewish state is disputed. This has created an atmosphere in which anti-Semitic and anti-Israel comments and actions are more frequent. Professor Troy has been a courageous scholar and leader in helping us to understand and support Israel. In today's program, we look forward to learning about his personal journey in Zionism and his guidance as a historian and as a now proud Israeli. And how do we support Israel? We encourage you to pose your own questions to Gil through the chat, addressing them to Renata. And if you wish, because it's so nice to have so many shuls with us today, please identify your shul. Rabbi Tina.
Good evening and Erev Tov here in Toronto. I am honored to be here this evening. Professor Troy is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, currently living in Jerusalem. Gil Troy is an award-winning American presidential historian and a leading Zionist activist. Professor Troy has published essays in the American, Canadian, and Israeli media, including writing essays for New York Times, as well as he wrote a weekly column for the Daily Beast, Secret Lives, which in current events in historical perspective, and writes a weekly column for the Jerusalem Post. In the foreword to Troy's latest book, Zionist Ideas, Professor Troy the foreword is written by Natan Sharansky, and he states the following: this magnificent work, the Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland Then, Now, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow. This magnificent work is a perfect follow-up to Arthur Hertzberg's classic, The Zionist Idea. So many of us have on our bookshelf, combining, like Hertzberg, scholars' eye and an activist ear. We demonstrate that we now live in a world of Zionist ideas with many different ways to help Israel flourish as a democratic state. Reading Professor Troy's book, I found one of the most moving quotes written by Jewish feminist scholar, Dr. Blue Greenberg. She writes the following: Israel has done more to confirm my faith and identity and gratitude than I could have ever imagined. I look for in the paper when I wake up in news about Israel, but it is more than the immediate urgency. Simply to think about the miracle of Israel, I must say it thrills me. Oh, I have many anxieties about the other stories of 48, about integrating the claims of Palestinians to the land, about world opinion, and most of all about peace that seems so elusive. But I also celebrate the cosmic significance of Israel at the very core of my being. And I would align my thought in the core of my personal being as well. I hope to hear, and for all of you, to hear Professor Troy truly in a mode of listening. Listening requires openness and silence. Silence within myself and all the rest. Not to rush with already a response that has been well formulated years or months before, but actually allow a scholar who spends his life and every breath trying to understand and to educate, to guide me through complexity and entrails into the subject matter that lives in my and yours kishkas. Welcome. Welcome to Darchei Noam. Welcome all the synagogues who've been and shuls who've been so supportive, and to all of you with open mind and an open heart. May it be a memorable hour for us. Bruchim Chabayim.
Erev Tov. Thank you, Rabbi Tina, for that wonderful and inspiring and challenging introduction. Because indeed, during these times, we're really good at yelling at one another. We're really good at jumping to conclusions. We're really good at jumping on one another. But that power of the still small voice and the power of the discipline just to listen to one another is something that we haven't been exercising much, especially south of the border. I know Canadians are a little more polite and a little better brought up. On many of these issues, my Rebbe is the former New York mayor, Ed Koch. He said, if you agree with me on 7 of 12 things, please vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 of 12 things, please see a psychiatrist. The notion that we have to agree on everything in order to start a conversation or to vote for somebody or to support a country sets up an artificial barrier. And it also forces us into sometimes supporting positions we don't want to support, and sometimes denigrating people, positions, and countries we don't want to denigrate. Back when travel was a verb, and I used to go to universities, I would say, if I hear you say, if the students say to me, hallelujah, I see the light, I say, you make me nervous. Because somebody else is going to come, they're definitely going to be taller, they're definitely be better looking, they're definitely be funnier, and you'll see their light. But if you say, hallelujah, I see the grays, I see the messiness, I see the complexity, then we can start our conversation. So I look forward to this conversation with you. I thank you for inviting me to share this time with you. And I want to take about half an hour of your time to give a couple of thoughts and then open it up for questions. And in the spirit truly of questions, feel free to ask what's important to you. And there's no such thing as a dumb question. And I've been defending Israel for over 20 years on campus. There's no such thing as a question that will offend me. So the title of tonight's discussion is Why I'm a Zionist, Progressive Zionism in a Post-Zionist World. And there's a subtext to it, which is that progressive Zionism is not an oxymoron. You can be a progressive as a Zionist. In fact, if we really understand what Zionism is, and we go back to the core of the Zionist idea, we understand how deeply intertwined liberalism and Zionism, progressivism and Zionism are in their DNA. And just as a kind of opening exercise, let's think of a couple of my favorite quotes. In 1958, Golda Meir, the foreign minister of the state of Israel, the new state of Israel, a few years later should become only the third woman in history to become a prime minister in 1969. She celebrates the 10th anniversary of the state of Israel. And what does she say? Even then, nationalism was a problematic word for people of the left, for Jews. Shortly after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, after the Nazis had shown how nationalism can be hijacked and distorted and used in the ugliest possible terms. But Golda Meir understood that nationalism is a neutral term and can actually also be a constructive term. And she embraced a nationalism which is constructive and wholesome. And the nationalism she talked about is a nationalism of a unique national character, of cultural heritage, of economic and social progress, of broadening and deepening ties of friendship and cooperation. So there's a line, she said, between acceptable nationalism and national aggressiveness. She said in these 10 years, right back in 1958, 1 million people, 1 million Jews, most of them refugees from scores of countries, have come to our shores and found new homes in their ancient homeland. Isn't that an amazing story? Look at what we've done in these 10 years. Migration, establishing a democratic society, natural resources, education, learning, science, resurrecting the language of Hebrew. That's Zionism. That was her form of socialist Zionism. To use Jewish nationalism, meaning Zionism, as a model. Did she think that Israel was perfect? Of course not. In fact, in 1966, when David Ben-Gurion would be asked, well, what do you think? Has this country achieved all its dreams and all your dreams? He said, not yet. And I want to invite you into a journey about not yet Zionism, about progressive Zionism, which is a Zionism of critique and of hope, a Zionism of dreaming, of achieving, but also of always stretching for more, saying, how can we do better? What else needs to be done? And let's make it a little more complicated, because in 1958, Golda Meir was celebrating an anniversary moment. And think about it, in 1958, Israel was fragile. The 48 war, the 56 war, the Tzena, starving, the weakness, the absorbing so many immigrants. So Israel was fragile, but Zionism was robust. Zionism had talked its way into a state. Today, Israel is robust, but the Zionist conversation has turned fragile. And I say, shame on them. Shame on our haters, the haters that the rabbi mentioned at the beginning and that Bonnie mentioned at the beginning. Shame on our detractors who can see no grays, who only see us all as black. And our right-wing friends who only see us all as bathed in light. I'm suffering from that kind of conversation. So I also say shame on us. We can't run away from the Z word just because some people hate us. And people always say, what's wrong with us that we're accused? And I say, don't focus on the accused, focus on the accuser. But let's acknowledge that we live in a complex world. Let's go to 1982, almost 40 years ago, during a low moment in Israeli history, when on Rosh Hashanah, Jews throughout the world are gathering to celebrate the new year. But so many of us are reeling from the knowledge that Israel, during this difficult moment in Lebanon that it was having back then, had stood by as the Sabra and Shatila massacres occurred, where Christian phalangists killed hundreds of Palestinians. And Leonard Fine, a thoughtful, struggling, progressive Zionist, said, There are two kinds of Zionists in the world. Most of us are both. We want to be normal, we want to be special. We want to be a light unto the nations. We want to be a nation like all the other nations. We want to have a Zionism of the soul and a Zionism of the body. He says, you know, I could live in the world of false choices, but an amazing line. I vastly prefer a people, a Jewish people, my Jewish people, our Jewish people, that chooses to risk a collective nervous breakdown, as we do by constantly endorsing both versions, balancing, juggling, struggling, muscle and conscience, body and soul. So welcome to the mess. And when I say to you, which Israel do you see? Do you only see the Israel of fights between religious and non-religious, or between Israelis and Palestinians? Or, as we see on the right, do you only see an Israel of Havana Gil and blue and white flowers and perfection? Both extremes don't work. Both extremes undermine the complexity, the richness, the multidimensionality of Israeli life. And my friends, at the risk of sounding a little bit arrogant, my progressive Zionist friends in the United States, in Canada, throughout the world, have to learn from their progressive Zionist friends right here in Israel. Because right here in Israel, we have so many progressives who serve in the army, who will fight to defend the state, but will also, in fighting to defend the state, are fighting to defend their right to criticize the state. And we know that Israelis aren't known for pulling their punches. And so they will criticize with a whole heart, with a full volley of ammunition, but they'll also use that full volley of ammunition when necessary to defend the state. So before we continue, unfortunately, we have to do a bit of an exorcism. I'm going to guess that there's somebody on this slide whom you hate. Donald Trump, I'm guessing, maybe others. Focus on that person. Take all your negative energy. Take all the ugly things you've heard about Zionism and focus on that person. Let them carry it. Because unfortunately, even though most progressives are taught, don't be essentialist. Don't reduce somebody to a stereotype. There's an essentialist hatred of Israel today. People use all kinds of words about Israel and describe Israel in sweeping terms that they would never use for any other country or any other people. Shortly before COVID, I gave a version of this talk at Harvard University. And it was canceled for personal reasons. It was really March, you can see March 2020. But look what happened when in a Harvard dormitory, a poster for Why I'm a Zionist was put up. It was ripped down. It was vandalized. No other poster would be vandalized like that. Why are we demonized like that? So we need this exorcism. We need to exorcise the apartheid lie. You want to criticize Israel, fine. But the clash between Israelis and Palestinians is a national clash, not a racial clash. It took Israelis, it took Zionists a long time, decades, to acknowledge and respect Palestinian nationhood. And in doing that, I say we have a situation of two nations in love with the same land. To racialize it, to claim that Jews are white, is to lie about who the Jewish people are, because we know we're a mix, and to lie about who the Palestinian people are. It's not a racial conflict. The A word is used, the R word is used, apartheid, race are injected in order to demonize Israel. And so when someone calls out Israel as apartheid, I don't care whether you love Netanyahu or hate Netanyahu, when that word is used, I know it's not an honest critique, it's a dishonest critique, it's a demonization. It's not a racist issue, it's a national clash. Similarly, when Israel is seen as some kind of plantation and words like settler colonialism are used, and Palestinian lives matter is the only variation on Black Lives Matter that's acceptable. And Americans foolishly take, because we know Americans have a slight tendency to look at the mirror and think everything that goes on in their country is happening everywhere else in the world. And so they think that the racial reckoning that's going on in the United States is a lens with which to see what's going on in Israel. And they don't realize how much distorts. We call them out and say, don't distort the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and turn it into your conflict. Don't see it through a George Floyd lens. Don't claim that American police needed some kind of Israeli training in order to beat up on blacks. Don't accept the fact that in 2016, Black Lives Matter had a foreign policy focused on one country, Israel. And I'm happy to say, thanks to effective, progressive pushback from within the progressive camp, this political platform line from the initial Black Lives Matter platform was changed. And now they don't deal with Israel because they don't need a foreign policy. They have enough issues challenging them in America itself. So effective action can take place. In fact, one of the things I want to challenge to us tonight is to say, stop using the phrase Arab-Israeli conflict. Add an S. It's the Arab-Israeli conflicts. There used to be a conflict with Egypt. Now there's a peace treaty. With Jordan, now there's a peace treaty. With the UAE and Sudan and Morocco, now there are peace treaties. For years we've been yelling peace now. I yell peace more. The more peace we have, with more pieces of the conflict, the more elements of the conflict, the more countries in the conflict, the more we can exercise that love gene, that peace gene, that justice gene, and the closer we can get to some kind of agreement that works things out. So no, Israel's in South Africa. No, Israel is in some kind of plantation. And no, no, no. When people use phrases like Jewish supremacy, I always say just use the initial German, because that's where it came from, the Jüdische Vorherrschaft. Stop using these phrases that are demonizing. Stop applying ideas from other conflicts, as occurred in Bosnia, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Arab-Israeli conflicts. It's complicated enough. So now that we've exercised all those issues, and I'll be happy to obviously talk about them in more clarity and in more detail in the Q&A, let's start dreaming Zionist dreams. And let's ask the question, what is Zionism? Well, we have one more obstacle. I mentioned it briefly before. Nationalism is now seen to be a dirty word. And, you know, we know Canadians often say, oh, we're not nationalistic. Well, the best way to prove a Canadian's nationalism is to introduce a Canadian to an American. So if you'll indulge me, two little jokes. What do we call a sophisticated American? A Canadian. Brumchu. Why don't Canadians go around sleeveless? Not because of the cold, because they're not allowed to bear arms. Get it? Canadians have their own nationalism going on. And that's perfectly legitimate. In fact, I don't know of an effective country, a successful country. I don't know of a democracy which can function without some sense of national pride. So again, nationalism, and we now live in a world with 192 countries in the United Nations. Nationalism is simply the way we organize our society, the way we organize nations, and we need effective liberal nationalisms in order to function. And I will not allow Donald Trump or some of the Hungarian extremists or the Polish extremists or the white nationalists in the United States to hijack that term. I will not allow them to sully that term. I will not allow the first name of nationalism to be white or Trumpian. I want the first name of nationalism to be liberal. And I want my form of Jewish nationalism, Zionism, to be liberal, democratic Jewish nationalism. There are others who say, okay, I get the nationalism thing, but who needs Israel? We have a new Zion right here in Toronto, right here in Montreal, right here in New York or Philadelphia. One kind of time, Zionists felt they had to kind of negate Canada or America or the UK in order to build themselves up. We live in a world today of messiness, of juggling. I think you can be a proud Canadian Zionist, a proud American Zionist. We all juggle different identities. This is another identity to juggle. And perhaps most terrifying, when we speak to our kids and our grandkids, sometimes they're not yelling and screaming about Israel. You know, when somebody says, I'm embarrassed by Israel sometimes, that shows a sense of belonging. Nobody's embarrassed by what Syria does. Maybe we're embarrassed as human beings, right? But you don't have that sense of shayachut, of belonging to Syria. Too many of our young people just say, as they sang in a chorus line, and I felt nothing. I want us to feel something. I want us sometimes to feel anger. I want us sometimes to feel criticism, but I also want, as the rabbi said at the beginning, for us to feel pride and commitment and connectedness. I want it to be a kishkas thing. I don't want it to be sterile. And of course, we know that we Jews, we do a beautiful thing. We give the far right today and the far left, who are so divided on so many things, something they can agree on, Jew hatred. But it's dismaying to me that too many of my left-wing friends are so busy fighting the very important fight against right-wing hatred, right-wing Jew hatred, right-wing anti-Semitism, that they don't call out progressive anti-Zionism, progressive Jew hatred, university Jew hatred. And so all they do is yell and scream about Trump and right-wing and white nationalism. It doesn't help. Nobody's listening. Similarly, my right-wing friends need to stop yelling so much about left-wing anti-Semitism and call out right-wing anti-Semitism. But it's a myopia. It's easy for me to see it from those I already hate. Call out it in your own allies. That's the hard work. So what would true intersectionality be? Would say that, yes, we live in a world of complexity. We live in a world where we have overlapping struggles, overlapping challenges. Too many of us sometimes are blinded by bigotry, but we also want to create something. We want to create a sense of positive nationalism. So I don't care where you stand, left, right, religious, non-religious, whether you live here in Jerusalem or you live in Toronto. We are all living in a world where the conversation has been distorted. So if 100 years ago, Zionism revived pride in the label Jew, today, I want to focus on how we must take back the night, which I learned from my feminist friends and my gay friends and my African-American friends, and revive pride in the label Zionism. And we start with a very basic question. In a world where we all live so well, I took a quick look during the nice introductions at your very comfortable living rooms. We all live very comfortably. We all live freely as Jews in Toronto and Montreal and New York and Philadelphia. And in fact, we live in a world where we knew that in the fight between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, the one thing we knew is that both presidents of the United States would have Jewish in-laws. We now have a Jewish Mr. Vice President. Harry Potter himself is Jewish, Daniel Radcliffe. So who needs a Jewish state? We have to go back to fundamentals. And that is why when I was asked to update the book, The Zionist Idea, which is became such a popular book when it came out in 1959 that here's a beat up copy by my friend David Breakstone, it needed an update. I made 3 moves that show my structure, my way of getting to both the progressive Zionist conversation and a modern Zionist conversation for how we can have the kind of conversation with ourselves, with our kids, with our grandkids, with our neighbors, with fellow progressives about what Zionism is. So the first thing, beyond what I think is a nice cover, we go from the Zionist idea, one monolithic Zionism, which you must agree with, to the Zionist ideas. Open up the conversation. Left, right, religious, non-religious, male, female, gay, Ethiopian, black, white. Bring in different voices. And notice the S is like a question mark. I'm tired of a Zionism that says, you must think this way. I want to ask questions. My questions are, and the Zionist questions are, who are we as a people? Where have we been? Where are we going to? What do we want to achieve? Think of it as the 3 B's of Zionism. Being Jewish is just a state of mind. You're born into it. Belonging to the Jewish people is saying, oh, now I'm part of something. And belonging to the Jewish people, the second B, in order to become something. So being, belonging, becoming, takes that sense of membership and turns it into tikkun olam, turns it into that catalyst for growth, individually and collectively. And Zionism says we as a people have an opportunity to make the world a better place, not simply by dreaming in the air, but by rolling up our sleeves and rebuilding ourselves in our rebuilt homeland. So the first move is from Zionist idea to Zionist ideas. The second move is organize it by periods. So if we first had the pioneers, the founders, the crazy nudniks, and then the builders, who are we today? And some say, oh, we're nothing. And I say, no, no, no. Who are we? We're the torchbearers, because we've inherited something from our parents, our grandparents, the founders, the builders. And now we have to pass it on to the next generation. And what are we trying to pass on? Ultimately, what are human beings looking for? And here, let's take a sidebar in our final few minutes. I want to tell you the story of Jonathan Haidt, a scholar whose teacher, Richard Schwader, had written a fascinating article about autonomy, community, divinity. The words didn't mean much to him. But all of a sudden, he's sitting in India as an anthropologist. And he's around the table, and he's a little put off by all their weird customs in India. He doesn't like their bathroom customs. He doesn't like that the women leave when the men start talking about serious issues. But then all of a sudden he has an insight. He goes back to this article. He goes, oh, I get it. All those strange customs to me are props. He says, I come from a liberal world in liberal New York, but you could say, I think the same thing about liberal Toronto, of autonomy. I, me, my. We're really, really good at the I. But he says we're a little bit weak in community, and even weaker at divinity, at sanctity, at having something bigger than ourselves. And he understood that all these things were props, opportunities to build out a sense of community and a sense of divinity and sanctity. And so that, in a sense, is what Zionism is too to me. Excuse me. Zionism is a conversation that starts with autonomy. But as Ruth Gavison, the great legal scholar, warned, she says, if it's only about I, you become too thin. You don't have those thick affiliations, those thick connections. We need connectedness. And how do you do that? You get that through community. You get that through history. You get that through layers. You get that through shuls. You get that through 7 shuls working together. You get that through sense of a community, of connectedness, of belonging. Not just being, but belonging. David Mamet, the great playwright, says, real life consists in belonging. When I'm on a screen set, when I'm making my Hollywood movies and I'm working with a team, then I feel like I'm a part of something. I'm alive. So you go from the I, autonomy, to the us, community. But ultimately, it has to be, and this is for non-religious people too, about a sense of purpose, about something greater than ourselves. And so Zionism is not just a sense of community, but a sense of purpose. David Hartman translated that into the notion that we are a camp, and we will always be scarred and defined and have our memories about Auschwitz. But we will go forward and we will build a better tomorrow, because we aren't just a community defined by our scars, but we also have a vision of Sinai. And so, my friends, I want to invite you into a Zionist conversation, a progressive conversation, using a 3,500-year-old conversation about who we are, about what our morality is, about who our stories are, to build and dream and make the world a better place. And by doing that, we learn that it's not just me. I am not alone. When you're part of the Jewish people, you're never alone. When you're part of the Jewish people, you're part of something bigger than yourself. And what is progressivism other than a dream of how to make the world a better place? And I am arrogant enough and humble enough to suggest that for all its challenges and all its misfires, Israel, like Canada, like the United States, has been a democracy, one of the few democracies in the world that on the whole, in the last 75 years, has been contributing more, has been helping us help others, to go back to Golda Meir's vision, to go back to Leonard Fine's challenge. And I feel so lucky to be a part of this crazy people, constantly having this nervous breakdown. I'm dreaming, I'm stretching, I'm criticizing, but I'm also rolling up my sleeves and I'm building and I'm defending and I'm celebrating and I'm singing and I'm dancing. I'm Yisrael Chai. Thank you so much, people of Toronto. Thank you so much, progressives, for keeping us honest, for challenging us, for keeping us always, always with our dreams, with our values, with our hopes. Hatikva. Erev Tov, Laila Tov. Thank you. And now, Renata.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Troy. Took me a second there because I'm just so filled with your enthusiasm. I think we should clone you and send you to all the universities and synagogues. I have a few questions for you, and some of them you have touched on, so I would like you to elaborate some more. But I want to, first of all, thank the members of the congregations that have sent these questions in beforehand. City Shul and Beth Tikva. Thank you so much. You did more than your share. I've blended some of your questions, and I'm going to try not to be repetitive of what you said, but I think I'll ask the first question on the basis of your ending, the remarks that you've ended with, because I'd like to hear some more about this. And it deals with the people of Israel itself. Some people feel, and that's what this questioner has said, that Israelis seem to have become resigned to the status quo, that they've given up the prospects for change that's needed to achieve peace with the Palestinians. Do you see any possibility of a resumption of peace talks, or do you see any groups that are currently working for peace in Israel and are using some of that kind of energy that you've talked about?
Well, thank you for that. Unfortunately, because of the lack of travel and the back and forth in COVID, the stereotypes about what Israelis do and think have become even more cemented over the last 18 months. And one of the most underreported stories in the Jewish world, I'm not talking about the Montreal Gazette or the Globe and Mail or the CBC, in the Jewish world, is how incredibly excited Israelis were by the Abraham Accords. How incredibly excited the people in my neighborhood were about the opportunities to visit. Over 200,000 Israelis have already visited the UAE in the last year and a half. How many have invested? Now you say, well, what does that have to do with the Palestinians? I say that has everything to do with the Palestinians. So I'm going to answer that, and then I'll get more directly to the Palestinian issue. As I said in my remarks, the more we understand the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Arab-Israeli conflict, we free ourselves from the sense of despair. We free ourselves from the paralysis that nothing has changed in 75 years or in a century. A lot has changed. Sometimes we move in great strides. Sometimes we move step by step. And the more we connect to our new brothers and sisters in the UAE. And we saw just a couple months ago, these beautifully clad people in these white Arab dresses coming and walking around Jerusalem. First of all, that helps disprove the apartheid lie, because those Arabs, those dark-skinned Arabs, were embraced by Israelis. Didn't matter if the Israelis were light-skinned or dark-skinned, it wasn't racial. We were so excited to see them. And everybody was hugging and singing and dancing in the streets. And that story isn't reported because it doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't fit the narrative as the shut down Israelis. It doesn't fit the narrative of the closed down Israelis. So first, I know that part of the problem is that Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu kept on putting their fingers on the UAE Accords, on the Abraham Accords. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't something valuable. We should now take that from them. And if you really believe in peace, more peace, the better. That's why I say peace more than peace now. So that's one. But let's go directly to the Palestinian issue, because I think that's really the core of the question. I think it's very easy from afar to say that there's no progress. And I'll be judgmental. I think the biggest obstacle to peace right now is BDS. The biggest obstacle to peace is boycott and is Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian terrorists who don't allow the person-to-person normalization that we've seen Israelis are so excited to build with the UAE, right? In the UAE, what are we seeing? We're seeing a top-down peace that's also sort of catching up bottom-up. But with all this demonization of Israel coming, I'm sorry to say, from the Palestinian side, we can't build up. We can't have that. Now, one of the biggest obstacles to peace from our side are those very small groups of Israelis who right now in real time are beating up Palestinians. But there are indeed organizations, some of which I actually contribute to financially, among other ways, that every time there is a Palestinian whose tire is slashed or who is harassed or whose home is broken into, gets a visit of love from Israelis. My kids at Hartman High School, which is a religious high school, when an Israeli Arab high school, which had Israeli Jews and Arab Jews learning together, was attacked, the next day, my kids were led by their teacher, Drury, to go to that school and to embrace those kids. That doesn't make the headlines. So yes, there are some Israelis who are battening down the hatches, but there are also all kinds of Israelis who are trying to bring light. And we also right now are in the middle of a really interesting experiment by the most complex government that includes 4 Israeli Arab Knesset members and coalition members that is trying to figure out, how do we go forward? And are there challenges in that government? For sure. But am I far more optimistic today than I was 6 months ago when everybody says, oh, this government is going to survive? Or 9 months ago when we were showing how much we love democracy, that we had one election after another election after another election? So I don't buy the line that there hasn't been progress. I buy the line that the New York Times wants us to believe there isn't progress and the CBC wants to say there isn't progress, but that's not what's happening on the ground.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, that's like the ground level progress. What about at the government level progress? I've got a question here asking, is there any possibility of the resumption of peace talks? And associated with that is a question, or 2 questions that you can answer all together, I hope. Is there anyone on the Palestinian side to make peace with? And what about the whole idea of a one-state solution where Palestinians and Israelis live together? Is that consistent with progressive Zionism?
Okay, so first of all, I would say as a historian, it's hard enough for me to predict the past. I can't predict the future, and certainly not in the Middle East.
There.
So are there going to be peace talks? Who knows? Certainly, we need a Palestinian leader with credibility, which we don't have with neither with Hamas or with Abbas, and a Palestinian leader who's willing to make the leap that 70 to 80% of Israelis have made, which is acknowledging that the other side exists. My friend Yossi Klein Halevi puts it beautifully. He says, and I don't like to use the word intifada because that's their word for the evil, for the uprising, for the noble uprising, the shaking off. But he said the lesson of the first Intifada was to the right, which is that there are Palestinians. You can't pretend they don't exist. But the lesson to the second Intifada to the left, the Israeli left, was that the Palestinian leadership, not the Palestinians, the Palestinian leadership is not only ready to make peace, but it's not only ready to make peace yet with the fact that we exist. Before we can make peace, they have to make peace with the fact that we exist. Most Israelis made that move in the 1990s, starting in the 1990s, right? Menachem Begin didn't make that move. Golda Meir didn't make that move. But after Oslo, and even when he was a prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu made that move. So the first thing that has to happen is we have to make peace with the fact that it's complicated. That we're gonna, and look what President Herzog did the other day by lighting the Chanukiah at Hebron. He wasn't saying this is our land forever in the future, but he was saying, as a member of the progressive Zionist flank, as a member of the left, I am not gonna give up on our rights. I'm gonna acknowledge how deeply complicated this mess is. He says, I have relatives who were in Hebron for generations. I walk to Maaret Machpelah and I see how similar the cave of Abraham is to the Western Wall. I'm not going to deny my rights there. But who loves peace more? Someone who says, we stole that land and here we'll throw it back to you? Or someone like President Herzog who says, this is really precious to me. This is my legacy. And I'll never deny it is my legacy, but I might share it with you because of demographic realities. So peace talks have to occur between both sides who understand that. And I'm going to twist on your clever question of, are there Palestinians with whom to make peace? There are Palestinians I'm in contact with every single day with whom to make peace. The Palestinians who are part of this phenomenon called, I don't know if you've heard this, the Silicon Valley in near San Francisco. Do you know there's something called Silicon Wadi? Silicon Wadi, Wadi is those Palestinians in Ramallah, in Jenin, in Hebron, who aren't throwing stones, but are throwing all kinds of solutions and brainstorming to try to create 21st century answers to problems. My wife and I have actually invested in some companies that do that kind of thing. And so who are the Palestinians to make peace with? Not Mahmoud Abbas and not Hamas, but the Palestinians on the ground who want to have a better life for themselves and for their children. And no, I'm sorry. When people talk about a one-state solution, let's be honest, it's a zero-state solution. The progressive response, because what is progressivism? Progressively ultimately says that we want to be liberal nationalists. We want to be proud Canadians and good lowercase d Democrats, liberals. We want to be proud Americans and good lowercase l liberals. Why should we negate the Jewishness of our state? Einat Wolf, the great writer, has a great line about this. She says, you want to go all universalist on me? Why don't we start with Canada? Then let's go all universalist in America. Then we'll go to England. Then we'll go to Australia. There are 192 countries in the United Nations. She says, Israel's willing to be 100th. But why do we always have to be first? Why do we have to be the ones to first give up on our nationalism? Why do we have to be the first ones to give up on our collective rights? We have a 3,500-year-old love affair with the state of Israel and with the land of Israel that the state of Israel is based on. I don't get into that game where I say, we got to Israel first and I negate Palestinian rights. I know how painful it is when they negate my rights, so I'll never negate their rights. But why does their national conversation often start with negating mine? Why at York University can't they have Palestinian Nationalism Week? And I'd come and toast them with a non-alcoholic drink. Why does their assertion of Palestinian nationalism have to be Israel Apartheid Week? Big lie about Israel Week. And by the way, I say that's not mainstream Palestinians. That's a small core of Palestinian extremists. Don't let them run the conversation, and don't let the small group of Jewish one-staters like Peter Beinart, like Jewish Voices for Peace, who might get outsized columns in the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, Don't let them run the progressive conversation. Don't let them hijack progressive Zionism from us, which is rooted in a notion of who we are as a people, all the wonderful values we get from the people. I don't know how you go from generation to generation without being rooted in your own story, in your own narrative, and using that hub, that sense of family, as a basis from which to embrace others. But can you imagine a progressivism that isn't one based on pride, that isn't one based on national pride, that doesn't start with your story? That's not a community I want to be a part of. So no, Esperanto failed in the 1920s to create a universal language. And maybe you in Canada or the US want to start your universal experiment. I don't think it'll work. I want to respect Palestinianism and respect Americanism and respect Canadianism and respect Jewish nationalism, which is called Zionism. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but I think that's a core question.
Great answer, thank you. I think I have time for only one more question. So I'll go back to one that came from one of our member congregations. I believe this one came from City Shul, but both City Shul and Beth Tikva are very concerned with something that you know a lot about, is the young people, the younger generation, and the kind of animosity there is on university campuses towards Jewish students. And they're asking, how can we deal with the anti-Israel rhetoric and misinformation that they're getting on social media? How can we engage with them in understanding the Zionist dream and help them build positive attitudes towards the state of Israel?
Well, thank you. It's such an important question. It's such a painful question. I was in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, and I had so many conversations, both with young people and with parents and grandparents in Beverly Hills, kids going to UCLA and Harvard and McGill and Toronto, the best New York University, the best schools, feeling so burdened. And then I came back to Israel, and I immediately went from, when I finished quarantine, to a wedding. And I realized something in what I call this jujitsu, J-E-W, from the positive to the negative. I'm sorry, from the negative to the positive. In universities, they're succeeding sometimes in robbing us of our Zionist dreams. But here in Israel, like some of us, like me, we fight it every day, and we're constantly concerned with what's happening in Toronto and Montreal and the US. But most of my Israeli friends are just like living their lives. They're living the dream. So one of the things we have to do is we have to start, hopefully getting past this pandemic challenge and improve the back and forth. The more our young people come to Israel, experience Israel, that's the power of birthright, that's the beauty of birthright, that's the magic of birthright and Masa and all these programs. They come and they just live the dream, and they put all the craziness aside and all the hatred aside. What can we do there? I think three things. First, most important, way before they get to university, I call this Pilates, strengthen the core. We need what I call identity Zionism. We need to, in our day schools and in our homes and in our interactions with our kids and our grandkids, make sure that when they're 10 and 12 and 15, way before they enter university, that they have this deep love of Israel and they understand Israel in all its multiplicity. My friends on the left have to stop treating Israel simply as the central headache of the Jewish people and the great failure of the Jewish people. My friends on the right have to stop treating Israel as the most perfect thing ever, because if you treat Israel as unimpeachable, the first university professor, the first roommate, the first newspaper column that criticizes it will make it fall like a shattered piece of glass. And if you treat Israel as only a problem, you can't dream. So just like we know that Canada has its strengths and its weaknesses, we have to treat Israel as a multidimensional thing, but it has to be something that's within us. If it's really in the core of your identity, you're not going to defend Israel because you feel guilted into it. You're going to defend Israel because an attack on Israel is an attack on you. So part one of our re-education is identity Zionism on the way in. And then within university, a two-pronged plan. One is, We have to sit down, as I spend a lot of time doing, and I know some of you do, and work with our students. Explain to them what I was trying to explain to you at the beginning. And I'm happy to share this slide presentation with anybody who wants, about why it's not a race issue, why we shouldn't use issues like race reckoning and George Floyd and COVID to understand what's going on in Israel, to talk about the positive stories about the Arab-Israeli Accords, the Abraham Accords, to talk about what's going on in Israeli high tech, to tell a positive story, to tell a new song of Zion, to push back with facts. That's one half. But the second half is making sure that our young people don't spend their entire university careers responding to the hatred and responding to the lies, but also find enough allies so that they can work together and build together. But it's terrifying. I mean, I speak to my students at McGill, and they tell me, I went to the, it's called the feminist, it's fun, the feminist universal, I don't know what they call it, but somehow the feminists of McGill, and they said, oh, it's feminists of McGill, and they said, oh, you can't be a Zionist and feminist. Well, let's teach them about Zionist feminism. A gay student says to me, oh, I wasn't allowed into the LGBTQ society because you can't have a Z. What are you talking about? We have to call out these prejudices. We have to do it as a community. We have to, when it goes legal, help them use the legal resources they need to assert their rights. But most important of all, we have to sing this new song of Zion. The more we have a positive conversation about Israel, the more we stop being so defensive and apologetic and hypercritical, the more we in our community emphasize not the either and the or, but the ands and the buts. Jewish and progressive. Zionism and progressivism, not an oxymoron. And yes, you can be a Zionist feminist, because it's been done before. Betty Friedan ultimately stood up and said, I am a Zionist. You can be Zionist and proud and gay, and that was why I tried to bring in so many different voices in the Zionist ideas. The more we sing Hatikva, the hope, the more we make Zionism that leap of hope, that leap of community, the better off we are. And so I thank you for indulging me for an hour. It's the very start of a long conversation, but we have to have these conversations. We have to roll up our sleeves, think more creatively, and think not just with a furrowed brow, but with a big smile on our face. Because when I step back and I wake up tomorrow morning, as I will, rain or shine, in Jerusalem, because at the end of the day, when I compare the temperature you're going through and the temperature I'm going to go through tomorrow, I'm a meteorological Zionist of all things. And I jog for an hour in a free, democratic country, and I pass Arabs on the streets of the Rakevet of Jerusalem, free Arabs, sometimes women in hijab jogging, and I have that image in my mind, and I say, how many places in the Middle East can a woman jog in hijab freely and know she's not going to be harassed? And I see other people on that Rakevet, on that former railroad track, and I have to get really close to hear them talking, if they're jogging partners, to hear if they're Arabs or Jews, because we're all in the Republic of Sport, huffing and puffing, trying to lose those extra pounds. And I know that that's the real story of Jerusalem, and it doesn't make the headlines. I just want to convey that to you. And I want to join you. I want to invite you to come join me in living Hatikva, living the dream, for a week, for 10 days, for 2 months, for a year, or for your life. Do it from your home in Toronto. Do it from here in Jerusalem. But don't let them rob us of our dreams. Don't let them rob our kids of our dreams. And don't let them ever steal our hope away from us. Laila Tov, Hatikva. Thank you, Renata.
Laila Tov, thank you.
The rest.
I hate to cut it off because we have one more question, but I will ask my co-hosts, should we entertain that last question, or shall we just end on that very positive note of Hatikva?
We should end there. Just it is late at night for Gil, but I want to thank you for such an inspiring and informative talk. By the way, I am so dying to get on a plane and go back to Israel. We were going to go, and then it was canceled during COVID. So guys, we are torchbearers, and everybody can help and thank Gil by having informed and for me, less emotional and more knowledgeable conversations about Israel. And they are uncomfortable. They're not easy. It's easy to try and avoid them. But we do best in these conversations with more knowledge. So I encourage you to go to the chat or to go to chapters or wherever and look at Gil's books, particularly the Zionist ideas, which will give you that knowledge and background to be able to participate in these conversations. So we are going to close, of course, with Hatikva. I just wanted to, I looked at the history. It goes back to the 19th century. It was the closing song from the 6th Zionist Congress, exactly 120 years ago. And at the 18th Zionist Congress in 1933 in Prague, it was adopted as the anthem for what was still the dream of a Jewish state. Can you imagine Prague in 1933? And it's amazing to think of Israel today. And we are going to have our own native Prague Chazanit from Darchei Noam, Lenka Lechtenberg, close today with Hatikva. Thank you.
Sophia.